The day my father told me he had paid $60,000 for my brother's college and said I could figure it out, the world didn't crack open in a dramatic way. Tilted. Softly. Like a picture frame knocked slightly off level, just enough that you never stopped noticing it afterward. We were sitting at the old kitchen table, the one that had absorbed every version of me since childhood. Homework, tears, college dreams scribbled in blue ink along its worn edges. Sunlight slid in through the blinds in pale stripes, slicing the dust in the air into floating galaxies. I had rehearsed my smile all morning, practiced my voice in the bathroom mirror. I was ready to finally hear what I had waited for my entire life. "I got in," I said quietly. He didn't look up right away. He was stirring sugar into his coffee, slow circles like he was measuring time itself. "That's nice," he said. Not proud. Not surprised. Administrative. Then he added, casual as a tossed receipt, "Your brother's tuition deposit cleared today." My pulse jumped before I could stop it. I waited. Truly waited. For the bridge between those two sentences. For the part where he'd say, "And yours will too." He took a sip. 60,000 up front. Worth it. He needs stability. The silence after that was deafening. 60,000? My voice barely held together. That's amazing. He nodded once. Money shouldn't be something he worries about. I gripped the edge of the table. "So, about my tuition," I said carefully. "I got partial aid, but there's still a gap. I just need help with the first year." He finally looked at me then, like someone glancing at a minor inconvenience. "You're smart," he said. "You'll figure it out." The words landed not as advice but as a sentence. "Figure it out?" I repeated. "Loans. Work. Scholarships. Everyone does it." "But you didn't make him," I said. His jaw tightened. "Your brother is different." "Different how?" He hesitated, then said it like a diagnosis. "He's fragile." The word lodged itself inside my ribcage. Fragile. I looked at my hands, scarred from after-school jobs, from 100 small survivals. "So what does that make me?" He smiled faintly. "Strong." Trap snapped shut. I stood so fast my chair shrieked across the floor. "So being strong disqualifies me from help?" "Don't turn this into drama," he said. Drama. The family word for inconvenient pain. I walked out shaking, sat in my car with my acceptance email glowing on my phone like a fragile promise I suddenly wasn't sure I was allowed to keep. That night, while my brother posted photos of dorm shopping in his new laptop, I opened a spreadsheet and turned my future into numbers. Tuition. Rent. Food. Gas. Insurance. Interest. I learned that night what it feels like to watch your life become a financial equation no one else is solving with you. I learned that fairness isn't always denied with cruelty. Sometimes it's denied with a quiet shrug and a cup of coffee that never stops steaming. The weeks that followed moved like I was underwater, sounds dull and distant, faces blurred at the edges as if my mind had wrapped itself in gauze to survive what my heart couldn't yet name. School, everyone talked about graduation parties, about parents who had already booked hotels near campus for orientation weekend, about moving trucks and shopping lists. I nodded and smiled and offered half-truths that tasted like ash. "Yeah, I'm excited." Still working out some details. I became very fluent in that phrase. Working it out. Every night my laptop glowed until my eyes burned. Loan applications asked questions that felt like interrogations disguised as math. Income. Assets. Pendants. I typed my father's numbers into boxes that proved on paper I came from Comfort, while my bank account screamed that Comfort did not belong to me. The first approval came with an interest rate that made my stomach drop. I accepted it anyway. Then another. And another. By the end of the month, my name was stitched to debt so neatly it felt like it had always been waiting for me. Dinner one night, I mentioned I'd found a job near campus. My mother smiled faintly. "That's nice," she said. My brother glanced up from his phone. "Dad upgraded my meal plan," he announced. 3 hot meals a day plus guest passes. Dad beamed at him. He shouldn't be worrying about food while he's studying. I chewed my toast slowly. Tasted like cardboard. A week later, his acceptance package arrived in a glossy folder thick enough to feel like a magazine. My father spread the contents across the table like proof of investment: maps, housing agreements, scholarship letters, brochures full of smiling faces under blue skies. My acceptance had arrived as a PDF attachment in my inbox. No envelope. No ceremony. That night, after everyone went to bed, I opened my brother's folder and studied his campus like it was a foreign country. I wondered what it would feel like to arrive somewhere already expected. Move-in day came with brutal clarity. My parents loaded my brother's belongings into the SUV with careful hands: new mattress, mini fridge, desk lamp, boxes of fresh clothes still smelling like the store. My life fit into 2 suitcases and a trunk of secondhand kitchenware. My brother hugged my mother like he was leaving for war. She cried into his shoulder. My father clapped him on the back and slipped an envelope into his hand. "For emergencies," he whispered. No envelope passed to me. I hugged my mother last. She whispered, "You'll manage," as if it were prayer and prophecy combined. On campus, my brother disappeared into a sea of welcome banners and volunteers. I parked 3 blocks away because the close lots were full. I unloaded alone. My dorm smelled like dust and industrial cleaner. My roommate arrived later with her parents and 3 carts of belongings. They hugged her and left. I sat on my bed with my suitcase still open and tried to convince myself loneliness was temporary. The first month clawed into me. My schedule became a brutal grid: classes by day, work by night. I learned to sleep in stolen fragments. I learned that hunger isn't loud when you're busy. It whispers until it steals your balance. I learned exactly which groceries gave the most calories for the least money. Ramen, peanut butter, oats, bananas right before they spoiled. Meanwhile, my brother sent photos of football games and pizza runs, study groups that turned into parties. "College is insane," he texted. "Dad says if I fall behind, he'll get me a tutor." I read it at 1:14 a.m. while scrubbing dried syrup off diner tables and wondered what it felt like to have someone waiting to catch you. Midterms came like a trap. I failed my first physics exam by 3 points. I pressed my forehead to the cold hallway wall and counted my breaths. I didn't have the luxury of failure. Failure cost money. So I begged for extra library shifts. I traded sleep for practice problems. I passed the retake. Barely. Passing became my ambition. Not excellence. Survival. On Thanksgiving, I went home because I still believed empty chairs meant something. My brother sprawled on the couch, tan and relaxed, showing my father photos from a weekend trip his roommate's family had paid for. Dad asked about his GPA. Mom asked about his dating life. Then they turned to me like they'd almost forgotten I belonged to the room. "Working a lot?" Dad asked. "2 jobs," I replied. He nodded approvingly. "Good. That builds character." The word landed like a stamp on my forehead. Character. Like it was currency I was being forced to mint with exhaustion. That night, alone in my old room, I opened my loan statement. Even in a few months, the balance had grown. Interest never slept. I thought about my brother's tuition sitting safely paid in full while mine fermented quietly into obligation. Resentment settled in like a slow, controlled burn. By winter, my body started betraying the lies I kept telling myself about being fine. It began with my hand shaking for no reason. Then came the dizziness, short, sharp spells that made the world tilt sideways for a second before snapping back into place. One morning I woke up and couldn't feel 2 fingers on my left hand. Panic washed through me so fast I had to sit on the floor to breathe. faded after a few minutes, leaving behind a dull, ghostly numbness that followed me through the day like a warning label I couldn't peel off. Campus nurse called it exhaustion. "You're burning the candle at both ends," she said gently. I almost laughed. Rest was a luxury item. That same week, my brother called cheerful and careless. "Dad's thinking about upgrading my housing next semester," he said. "The building I'm in now is kind of noisy." I stared at the cracked ceiling of my dorm. "That's great," I said. "You sound weird lately," he added. "Like colder." "Cold." I bit my tongue. Cold was what you became when you learned no one would hand you warmth. Finals wrapped the campus in caffeine and panic. I studied in the library until closing, then in empty hallways until security shooed me out, then on my bed with the light off so my roommate could sleep. I passed every exam by margins so thin they felt like mockery. Winter break came and I delayed going home as long as I could, picking up extra shifts instead. One night, scrubbing grease from the diner floor long after closing, I slipped and slammed my elbow so hard my arm went dead. Cook cursed and hauled me up. "You're killing yourself for tips," he muttered. I didn't answer because I didn't know how to explain that I was killing myself for access to oxygen. When I finally went home 3 days before Christmas, the tree was already up, wrapped in white lights and gold ribbon. Presents crowded beneath it, most tagged with my brother's name. He had flown in that afternoon carrying expensive luggage my parents had bought him for the possibility of study abroad. At dinner, Dad poured wine and toasted a year of progress. He clinked glasses with my brother. Then he turned to me. "Still working all the time?" "More," I said. He nodded. "Good." The words sat between us like a verdict. Later, my brother cornered me in the hallway. "You know Dad's right, though," he said quietly. "You're built for pressure. I'd fall apart if I had to do what you're doing." I stared at him. "You wouldn't even know how," I said before I could stop myself. His face darkened. "Why are you so bitter?" "Bitter?" I almost laughed. I almost screamed. Instead I said, "I'm not bitter. I'm awake." Christmas morning, my parents watched my brother open a new tablet, new shoes, and a check labeled next semester living expenses. When I opened my only envelope and found a $50 gift card inside, my mother smiled brightly. "We didn't know what you'd want," she said. I thanked her because gratitude had become my reflexive survival mask. That night, lying under the glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to my childhood ceiling, I remembered my father telling me years ago that I didn't need a nightlight because I was braver than most kids. Brave, strong, independent. The holy trinity of abandonment dressed as praise. When I returned to campus in January, something inside me had shifted. The anger no longer flared hot, cooled into a blade. I stopped calling home. I stopped offering updates. I started moving in silence. I took on freelance design work through a professor who noticed my late-night submissions. Pay was modest at first, but it was mine. Every dollar felt like a quiet declaration. I exist beyond their permission. Then March arrived with a surprise lab fee I hadn't budgeted for, nearly $1,000 due in 10 days. My account hovered near zero. I sat on my bed staring at the email until my vision blurred. I thought about the camera I had saved for 2 years to buy, the one thing I owned that felt like joy. I sold it in a grocery store parking lot. The buyer handed me cash and smiled kindly. "You'll get another one," he said. I nodded, swallowing glass. That night, shaking with a mixture of rage and shame, I broke my own rule and called my father. I told him about the fee, about the sold camera, about how close I was to the edge. "I'm not asking for much," I said quietly. "Just a loan." His reply came fast and rehearsed. "If I keep saving you, you'll never learn." The words hollowed my chest. "You saved him," I whispered. "He didn't need to learn," my father said. "You do." The line went dead. I didn't cry. I stared at the phone until something in me went eerily calm. In that moment, I finally understood. Their help had never been about need. It had always been about preference. And I was not the preferred child. The next morning, when I paid the lab fee with the last of my savings, I felt something strange settle into place. Not defeat. Not hope. Detachment. I was done asking a locked door to open. After the lab fee and the sold camera and the last cold "you need to learn," something in me stopped reaching. Not just for my parents, but for anyone who had already decided who I was supposed to be. I went back to campus with a kind of numb focus. I woke up, worked, studied, slept in fragments, repeated. My life shrank to tasks and deadlines. Feelings were a liability I couldn't afford. My body, however, didn't care about budgets. The first real crash happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the library. I had been sitting in the same chair for 3 hours, head bent over my laptop, eyes aching. My stomach had been growling so long it had gone quiet, which I'd learned was its way of giving up. I stood to go print an article and the floor just tilted. The next thing I knew, I was on my knees between the stacks, heart pounding in my ears, vision tunneling to a narrow black tube. Someone's voice sounded far away. A hand touched my shoulder. Hey. Hey. Are you okay? I heard myself say, yeah, I'm fine, because that word had become my reflexive lie. Then the world blurred again. When I came back fully, I was in the campus clinic, lying on a narrow bed with a cheap blanket pulled over me. A nurse with kind eyes clipped a blood pressure cuff around my arm. You scared a couple of students, she said lightly. Collapsed in the library. That's dramatic even for midterms. I tried to smile. Sorry. She frowned at the numbers on the machine. When's the last time you ate a real meal? Question caught me off guard. Today. What did you have? Coffee, I said. And half a granola bar. She gave me a look I recognized from every adult who had ever realized I was held together with tape. You can't keep doing this, she said gently. Your body is sending distress signals. I'm just busy, I muttered. Everyone's busy. Not everyone is fainting in public, she replied. They made me stay for observation for 3 hours. They gave me crackers and juice like I was a child. I felt humiliated and weirdly safe at the same time. Someone was finally looking at me and saying, "This is not normal." When they discharged me, the nurse handed me a printout about stress and nutrition. You need support, she said quietly. Do you have family helping you? I laughed without meaning to. They paid 60 grand so my brother wouldn't feel like this, I said. I'm the one who's supposed to learn from it. Her face softened in a way that made my throat tighten. That isn't fair, she said. The words were so simple they almost broke me. It wasn't fair. Not complicated. Not nuanced. Just not fair. Back in my dorm, my roommate asked if I was okay. I lied again. Just low blood sugar. I didn't tell her that I'd almost passed out once already that month at work and pretended I'd just stood up too fast. That night, I skipped my shift for the first time in a year. I texted my manager some vague excuse about a medical emergency, then sat on my bed in the dark and listened to my own breathing. I thought about the hundreds of hours I'd poured into surviving. All the times I'd bitten my tongue instead of saying "this hurts." All the times my father had said, "You'll figure it out," like handing me a shovel and pointing at a collapsing mine. And then something new slipped into my thoughts, quiet but sharp. If they were willing to watch me drown to teach me how to swim, maybe I needed to learn somewhere else. 2 days later, my brother called. His voice was tight, annoyed. Dad says you refused to help with some paperwork, he said. Yeah, I replied. I was busy fainting. He ignored that. He's pissed. Says you're being selfish. I almost choked. Selfish? You know how stressed he is with my tuition and everything, my brother continued. Aren't you at least a little grateful he's doing so much for me? He doesn't have to. There it was, that familiar knife dressed as a compliment. I took a slow breath. I am not ungrateful, I said carefully. I am just no longer willing to carry the part of your gratitude he refuses to teach you. What does that even mean? He snapped. It means, I said, that I'm done pretending it's normal to help fund your comfort while drowning in my own debt and exhaustion alone. He went quiet. You've changed, he said finally. Yeah, I replied. I had to. Hanging up that night didn't feel like slamming a door. Felt like closing one gently and finally locking it from my side. Life didn't magically get easier after that. My bills didn't vanish. My loans didn't shrink. But my mind changed angles. Instead of constantly thinking how do I make them proud, the question quietly shifted to how do I get free? I leaned harder into freelance work. A professor who liked my design projects connected me with a small local business. They needed a logo, a website banner, social media graphics. The pay was still small, but it was more than the diner some weeks, and I didn't have to inhale fryer grease to earn it. Then another client came, referred by the first. Then another. I worked until my hands cramped, but for the first time the effort felt like it had somewhere to go besides the bottom of a pit. The end of the semester, I sat in the financial aid office with my updated balance sheet. It was still terrifying. But it was mine. Not a favor to be revoked. Not a grudging gift handed out with a lecture. Mine. When summer planning came around, my father called, already assuming my answer. You'll be coming home and working at the warehouse again, he said. Save on rent. Put money toward your loans. In the past, I would have agreed before he finished. This time I stared at the internship email open on my screen, an offer from a mid-sized company downtown for a paid position in their design department. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't permanent. But it was real. I got a paid internship, I said. I'm staying near campus. He scoffed. Those things pay pennies. You need real money. I glanced at the number in the email again. It was more than I'd make at his warehouse, and without his running commentary about my attitude, it's enough, I said. And it's experience. You're making a mistake, he replied. You're throwing away easy money because you're stubborn. No, I said quietly. I'm refusing to be indebted to someone who thinks help is leverage. We're your family, he snapped. Without us, you'd be nowhere. I looked around my small dorm room, at the stacks of notes, at the cheap lamp, at the laptop I'd bought on a payment plan under my own name. Without them, I would be tired, indebted, scared. With them, I was tired, indebted, scared, and blamed for it. I think I'll take my chances, I said, and ended the call. My hand shook afterward. A part of me still expected the sky to fall when I defied him. It didn't. The sky stayed exactly where it was. Summer arrived without ceremony. No beach trips. No reunions. Just heat rising from the sidewalks and the constant hum of traffic outside my small rented room near campus. I started the internship on a Monday so hot the air felt chewable. The building wasn't impressive, gray exterior, flickering fluorescent lights in the hallway, but to me it felt like a doorway to a different timeline. Place where effort turned directly into growth instead of blame. First week was brutal. I made mistakes. I stayed late fixing them. I learned software shortcuts at night and applied them the next morning like tiny acts of rebellion against the version of me that had only known survival. Paycheck arrived 2 weeks later. When I saw the deposit hit my account, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my phone until my eyes filled with tears. It wasn't a fortune, but it was the first time money had entered my life without carrying a lecture, a condition, or a reminder of what I owed someone emotionally. I kept working, harder than ever, but differently now. This time the work was building instead of erasing me. Meanwhile, my family carried on in their parallel universe. My brother posted photos from weekend trips, from restaurants with menus that didn't list prices. My father sent a group text once about upgrading the backyard again. New deck. Fire pit. Door TV. I read it after finishing a 12-hour shift and felt something strange. Not envy, not rage, distance. The upgrades no longer felt like evidence of what I lacked. They felt like proof of where I no longer lived. One night near the end of June, my brother called unexpectedly. He sounded different, less confident. "Dad's stressed," he said. "The deck went over budget, and my tuition payment for next semester is due soon." I waited. "He says he might need to cut back on some things." I stayed silent. "He asked if you'd be willing to help, just temporarily," my brother added carefully. The words echoed in my chest in a way I hadn't expected. Help them. Temporarily. After everything. I looked around my tiny room. The thrift store desk. The lamp with a loose switch. The stack of bills pinned under a magnet on my mini fridge. "No," I said. "Why not?" he asked. "Because you will never understand what this cost me if I keep paying the bill for your comfort," I replied. He exhaled sharply. "So now you're punishing me?" "No," I said quietly. "I'm teaching you the lesson Dad taught me." Silence filled the line. Then, softly, "I didn't ask for this," he said. "Neither did I," answered and hung up. July blurred into August. My skills sharpened. My confidence followed. One of the senior designers pulled me aside after a presentation and said, "You're better than the interns we usually get. You ever thought about staying in this field long term?" I nodded, stunned. "Good," she said. "We like people who build quietly." When the summer ended, they offered to extend my contract part-time through the school year. I accepted without hesitation. For the first time, my schedule wasn't ruled entirely by desperation. I still worked too much. I still slept too little. But now I could see a ladder instead of a wall. When I went home once in early fall to pick up some old documents, the house felt unfamiliar. Quieter. Bigger. The new deck glowed under patio lights. My brother sat on his phone scrolling, looking vaguely restless. My father barely looked at me when I walked in. "You look different," my mother said slowly. "Tired," he added flatly. I smiled politely. "Busy." At dinner, conversations circled my brother as always. His schedule, his advisor, his new worries. My father complained about money for the first time I could remember. "Everything's expensive now," he grumbled. "You don't know how easy you had it," my mother murmured to my brother. I stared at my plate. After dinner, my father followed me into the hallway. "You could come back next summer," he said. "Work at the warehouse again." The offer wasn't kindness. It was control wearing a helpful face. "No," I replied. "I have work lined up." His lips pressed thin. "You're getting stubborn." I met his eyes. "You raised me that way." For a brief second, something like confusion flickered across his face. Not regret. Not guilt. Just surprise that the script had changed. I left the next morning with a box of old paperwork and the strange certainty that the house no longer held me emotionally. On campus, the fall semester hit like a controlled burn. Hard but purposeful. I worked. I studied. I paid my bills on time for the first time in my life without juggling them like knives. One night, Mira came over with cheap takeout and a 6-pack of soda. "You're different," she said after watching me answer a work email with steady hands. "You're not in panic mode all the time anymore." I thought about it. "I think I finally realized that I don't have a safety net," I said. "So I stopped jumping as if I do." By late October, I paid off an entire small loan in one transfer. I stared at the confirmation screen for a long time. It wasn't victory, but it was proof that the weight on my back could slowly be lifted. Then the call came. My father's number lit up my phone one evening while I was eating noodles straight from the pot. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. Your brother is switching programs, he said without greeting. The new one costs more. I waited. We may need help, he added. The words hit differently now. No longer a threat. No longer a command. Just a request with uncertain footing. You told me to figure it out, I said evenly. So did he. The silence on the line felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. You're really doing this, he said finally. I'm finally doing what you taught me, I replied. I hung up and realized my hands weren't shaking. The phone call where my father admitted he might need help should have felt like a victory. The man who once lectured me about self-reliance now stood on the edge of the same cliff he'd pushed me off years earlier. But it didn't feel triumphant. It felt clinical, like a math problem with the answer already written. After that call, days went by without follow-up. No apology. No attempt at conversation. Just silence. My mother texted once, "Things are tense here. Your father is under a lot of pressure." I stared at the message for a long time. I almost replied, "So was I," but erased it. Instead, I put my phone face down and kept working. My world had shrunk to manageable pieces: deadlines, invoices, classes, meals that actually contained real vegetables now. The panic that used to live under my skin full-time slowly moved out. Anxiety still visited, but it no longer paid rent. Then one Sunday, while I was meal prepping in my tiny kitchen, my phone rang again. My father. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered, bracing myself. "We need to have a serious talk," he said. He'd used that tone my whole life, the one that meant lecture, not conversation. "About what?" I asked. "About responsibility," he replied. "About family. About what you owe us after everything we've done for you." I leaned against the counter, staring at the pot simmering on the stove. "Okay," I said. "Let's talk about it." He wasn't expecting agreement. I could hear it in the way he paused. "Your brother is in a difficult situation," he started. Financial aid changed, housing costs went up, his program requirements, and I cut in. "And he needs support," my father said irritably. "This is what family is for. We step in when someone is struggling." The hypocrisy rang so loudly I almost had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Interesting," I said slowly. "Because when I was fainting from exhaustion, selling my camera, skipping meals, and begging you for help, you called it learning." "That's not the same," he snapped. "Why not?" "You're stronger," he said like it was obvious. "You could handle it." I laughed, the sound unfamiliar in my own mouth. "I didn't handle it. I survived it." "There's a difference." He exhaled sharply. "So now you're just going to let your brother sink?" "No," I replied. "I'm going to let him swim the way I had to. That's not cruelty. That's equality." "You're being vindictive," he said. "Punishing him because you're angry at us." I thought about that. Really thought about it. "If I were being vindictive," I said slowly, "I would enjoy this. I don't. Makes me sad. But I'm done paying for a system you refuse to admit was rigged." Silence hummed down the line. I could picture him pacing in the kitchen, jaw clenched, hand in his hair the way he always did when reality didn't obey him. "You wouldn't be where you are without us," he finally said. The words were meant to shame me. Instead, they landed like a sad joke. "You're right," I said. "Without you, I wouldn't have learned how to work 3 jobs on no sleep. I wouldn't have learned to sign loan documents alone. I wouldn't have learned that love without support is just a nice word. Those lessons shaped me." "See," he said, grabbing onto that tiny piece of agreement. "So you should be grateful." "I am," I replied. "Just not in the way you want. I'm so grateful I learned how to build a life without relying on you that I refuse to hand that power back now." He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You've become very cold." No, I said. I've become very clear. After we hung up, my hands were shaking again. But this time, it wasn't the panic tremor of the old days. It was adrenaline slowly burning off after doing something that scared me and needed to be done. A few days later, my brother called. His voice was smaller than usual. "Dad's furious," he said. "He says you've turned your back on us." I took a breath. "I turn my back on being the family's backup wallet and emotional punching bag," I corrected. "Not on you." "It doesn't feel that way from here," he muttered. I thought about all the years feeling had been weaponized against me. How my exhaustion, my hurt, my sense of unfairness had been labeled dramatic, ungrateful, immature. "You know what didn't feel great from here?" I asked quietly. "Watching $60,000 go to your tuition while I signed my name under thousands in loans, then being told it was good for me to suffer so I'd learn." He didn't answer. I pictured him staring at the floor, finally understanding that there had always been two narratives in our house, and he'd only ever been handed one. "I never asked them to do that," he said eventually. "I know," I replied. "Favoritism doesn't need your permission to hurt someone else." "So, what now?" he asked. "Now?" I said. "Now you do what I did. You talk to financial aid. You look for scholarships. You get a job. You learn how to build without a safety net." "That sounds hard," he said. I almost smiled. "It is," I said. "But it's also how you learn what you're actually capable of." After that, our conversations grew less frequent but more honest. He stopped bragging about nights out. He asked more questions about work, about budgeting, about juggling responsibilities. Sometimes I answered. Sometimes I let the silence teach him what mine never had the chance to. Meanwhile, my world kept expanding. My part-time role at the design firm turned into more responsibility. I started managing small projects. Clients emailed asking specifically for me. One afternoon, my manager called me into a glass-walled conference room. "We want to offer you a full-time position after graduation," she said. "With benefits, decent salary, a real path upward." The room spun, but not like the library collapse. This time it felt like the earth underneath me was solidifying instead of cracking. I took the offer letter home, printed it out, and taped it above my desk like a map out of a maze. That night, staring at the numbers, I thought about calling my parents. I thought about sending a photo of the offer, the way my brother used to send photos of his tuition receipts and dorm upgrades. For a few minutes, the old hunger for their approval twisted in my chest. Then I realized something. Their affirmation wouldn't change the salary. Their silence wouldn't lower it. Their pride or disappointment wouldn't affect the deposit that would hit my account. Their influence stopped at the edge of my new life. So I told Mira instead. She screamed into the phone and demanded we celebrate. We got cheap cupcakes from a grocery store and sat on my floor eating them with plastic spoons, laughing with our mouths full. It was the most loved I had ever felt in success, and it didn't cost me anything but honesty. As graduation approached, invitations went out. Families booked flights. Hotels filled up. I received an automated email reminding seniors to submit the names of guests who would need extra tickets. I stared at the blank form for a long time. Then I typed none. Later, my mother texted, "When is your ceremony again? We're not sure we can make it, things are chaotic here." I smiled sadly at my screen. I hadn't even told her the date. Graduation day arrived wrapped in sunlight and noise. Campus buzzed with parents dragging garment bags, siblings chasing each other between rows of folding chairs, camera flashes snapping like tiny bursts of thunder. I walked alone through the crowd in my cap and gown, my phone heavy in my pocket, silent. I had told myself I wouldn't look for their faces. Till my eyes searched on instinct. I didn't see my mother's anxious wave. I didn't see my father standing stiff with pride. I didn't see my brother slouched beside them, pretending boredom. I found Mira instead, already crying, holding a sign she'd made with glitter and cardboard that read, "You did this." The words hit harder than any applause ever could. When my name was called, the cheer that rose from her section felt like it came from an entire second family I hadn't known I was allowed to belong to. I walked across the stage with my head high, the weight of the gown familiar and grounding. For a moment I pictured my father's face if he were there, how he would nod once, reserved, as if success were an expected outcome instead of a victory carved from hunger and fear. The image faded as soon as it formed. I didn't need it anymore. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled onto the lawn. Families hugged. Photos were taken in clusters and tears. I stood with Mira and her parents and let them wrap their arms around me as if I were theirs too. Her mother kissed my cheek and told me she was proud of me. The word landed softly and stayed. That night, back in my apartment surrounded by half-packed boxes, a message finally came through. My mother. We saw photos online. Congratulations. Just that. No exclamation point. No questions. No apology. I stared at the text for a long time and then placed the phone face down without replying. I realized I didn't feel angry. I felt finished. 2 weeks later, I started my full-time job. New building. Real desk. My name on a door. I bought a blazer with my first paycheck and stood in front of the mirror in my bathroom, barely recognizing the woman staring back at me. She looked steadier. Thinner, maybe. But unbroken. The first deposit after taxes still felt unreal. I paid off 2 small loans in one afternoon. Confirmation emails lined up in my inbox like proof of breath after being underwater. That evening, my brother called. His voice was rougher than I remembered. "Dad had a meltdown," he said. "About money. About you. About everything." I listened. "He says you abandoned us." I leaned against my kitchen counter, watching the city lights blink on outside my window. "He abandoned me a long time ago," I said quietly. "I just stopped pretending otherwise." "He's struggling," my brother admitted. "Good," I said before I could stop myself. Then I softened. "I don't mean that cruelly. I mean maybe now he finally understands the cost of telling someone to figure it out." My brother was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I have a job now." The word surprised me. "Part-time," he added quickly. "At a campus lab. It's not much." I smiled. "It's a start." "Yeah," he said. "It is." We didn't talk long that night. But for the first time, our silence didn't feel like distance. It felt like thinking. Weeks passed. My life filled with meetings, deadlines, quiet routines that didn't involve panic. The savings account I'd once been afraid to check grew slowly but steadily. I paid off another loan. Then another. One evening, months into the job, I realized I hadn't checked my balance in days. The old reflex was gone. Late one Sunday, a knock came at my door. I opened it to find my brother standing there with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, looking exhausted. "Can I come in?" he asked. We sat at my table in silence for a moment. "Dad kicked me out," he said finally. The words hung between us. I didn't react right away. "Why?" "I told him I wasn't switching back to my old major just because it cost less," he said. "I told him I was keeping my job even if it slowed me down. He said I was ungrateful. I said so were you. Then he told me to leave if I thought I was so independent." I stared at him. "And now you're here?" He nodded. I didn't know where else to go. The irony sat heavy in the room. I poured him a glass of water and placed it in front of him. "You can stay on the couch tonight," I said. His shoulders sagged in relief. "Thank you." That night, after he fell asleep, I sat alone in my room thinking about how cycles break. Not in explosions, but in quiet moments where someone chooses differently than they were taught. My father had built his authority on money and silence. My brother had finally chosen uncertainty instead. Over the next weeks, he found a cheap shared apartment. He kept his job. For the first time in his life, he struggled in ways that didn't come with a parental safety net. And for the first time, he started to grow. My father didn't call after that. Not once. My mother sent occasional updates about the dog. Weather. Nothing that mattered. A year passed. Then another. I paid off the last of my debt on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in my office. I stared at the confirmation screen until my vision blurred. When I got home, I sat on my floor and cried, not from relief alone, but from the knowledge that I would never again owe anyone for my right to exist. That night, I thought of the kitchen table, coffee mug, the way my future had once been handed back to me with a casual shrug. The weight of that moment had shaped everything, but it no longer owned me. Sometimes liberation doesn't look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like a quiet apartment, a paid-off balance, and the steady hum of a life that no longer has to beg to be funded. Life settled into a rhythm I had never known before, quiet, steady, mine. Mornings were no longer panic alarms but routine. Coffee tasted different when it wasn't swallowed with dread. My brother adjusted slowly to his new reality. He learned how to stretch groceries across a week. He learned how it felt to open a utility bill and feel his chest tighten. Sometimes I caught him staring at his phone, thumb hovering over our father's contact like muscle memory arguing with pride. He never pressed it. That alone told me how deep the wound had gone. Then one evening, almost 2 years after graduation, my mother appeared on my doorstep without warning. I opened the door and froze. She looked older. Her hair, once always dyed, showed streaks of gray she hadn't bothered to hide. She held her purse like a shield in front of her chest. "I was in the area," she said awkwardly. I stood aside without a word and let her in. She stepped into my living room slowly, eyes moving over the furniture, the bookshelf, the framed photos on the wall. "You've done well for yourself," she said quietly. There was no accusation in her voice this time. No comparison. Just observation. We sat on opposite ends of the couch like strangers who shared history but not intimacy. "Your father," she began, then stopped. I waited. "He's not doing well," she admitted. "After your brother left, after the debts piled up, things changed." I nodded gently. I felt no rush of triumph. Only distance. "He misses you," she added softly. I looked at her then. "He never missed me when I was starving." The words weren't sharp. They were simply true. She pressed her lips together. "He thought he was teaching you strength." I gave a small, sad smile. "He taught me how to live without him." The silence stretched heavy between us. Finally she said, "He wants to see you." I shook my head slowly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." Her eyes filled with tears. "We didn't mean to lose you." I took a long breath. "You didn't lose me. You traded me." She flinched at that. When she left an hour later, she hugged me like someone afraid I might dissolve. I stood still in her arms, not cold but not returning what no longer belonged to me. Days later, my father called for the first time in years. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was rough, defensive, tired. "Your mother tells me you're doing well," he said. "I am," I replied. Silence sat between us like an unspoken ledger. "You didn't have to cut us off like that," he muttered. I almost laughed. "You cut me off financially at 18, I said. "I just followed your example." He grunted. "We did what we thought was best." "You did what was easiest," I answered. "For you." He grew quiet. When he spoke again, the anger had drained out. "I didn't think you'd make it," he admitted. That sentence, more than any accusation, landed hardest of all. I closed my eyes. "Neither did you teach me how," I said. But I did. After that, the wall between us didn't shatter. but it cracked just enough for the truth to seep through. My brother, meanwhile, grew into his struggle. He failed a class, then retook it. He worked late shifts. He paid his own rent. The version of him I had grown up with, protected, buffered, slowly gave way to someone harder, quieter, more real. One night over cheap pizza, he looked at me and said, "I finally understand." I swallowed. Understand what? That you weren't stronger, he said. You were just left alone longer. The words healed something in me that I hadn't realized was still bleeding. My father never apologized the way movies script apologies. There was no confession, no tearful breakdown. Instead, there were small, awkward acknowledgments. A hesitant, "You handled things better than I expected." A stiff, "You built something real." They weren't enough to mend what broke. But they were admissions that the story he'd told himself about me had been incomplete. And maybe wrong. I still didn't return home for holidays. I celebrated with people who didn't measure my presence against a ledger. Myra's family became my anchor. My brother built his own quiet life, separate from the shadow he used to live under. And my parents remained in the distance. Not enemies. Not family as they once were. Just figures on the edge of a life I had paid for myself. Some nights I stood on my balcony and thought about that long-ago kitchen table. Coffee mug. The shrug that had sent me into years of hunger and flight. I realized something then that felt almost peaceful. He had been wrong about me. Not because I failed, but because I succeeded without his approval. And that quiet defiance had cost more than $60,000. It had cost years of my life. But it had bought something priceless. Freedom. The first time I saw my father again in person, it wasn't by design. It was at a distant cousin's wedding, one of those obligatory events where relatives come out of storage like old decorations. I almost didn't go. Mira talked me into it. "You don't owe them presents," she said, "but you also don't have to live like they own your absence." So I went, wearing a simple dress I'd bought with money that had no strings attached, standing a little taller than I used to. The venue buzzed with small talk and clinking glasses. When I walked in, a few relatives did that double-take people do when they're trying to place you inside an old memory. "Is that really?" I heard someone whisper. My father was standing near the bar, glass in hand. He looked older. Not just in the gray at his temples, but in the slump of his shoulders, in the way his eyes moved across the room like they were searching for a version of his life that had slipped away without asking permission. Our eyes met across the crowd. For a moment, the room fell silent in my head. Just him. Just me. Just the long history of everything we hadn't said piled up between us. He didn't look angry. He looked cautious. Like I was a problem he hadn't yet solved. He crossed the room slowly. "You look different," he said finally. I smiled faintly. "You already told me that once," I replied. "On the phone. When you meant it as a complaint." A ghost of a smirk tugged at his mouth. "You remember everything," he muttered. "I had to," I said. No one else was keeping track. We stood there in silence while the DJ tested speakers and relatives laughed around us. "Your mother says you paid off your loans," he offered. "All of them." "I did," I answered. "That's impressive," he said, as if the word hurt going down. I tilted my head. "It was necessary." He shifted his weight. "I didn't think you'd manage it on your own," he admitted. "You were always," he hesitated, searching for a word that wouldn't offend me. "Stubborn," I supplied. "Emotional." "Human," I corrected. He exhaled long and slow. "I thought if I pushed you, you'd be stronger." "You didn't push me," I said. "You left me." He flinched like I'd hit him. "That's not how I saw it." "I know," I said softly. "That's the problem." Someone called his name from across the room. He glanced over his shoulder, torn between old duties and this new, fragile moment. I don't know how to fix this, he said quietly. The honesty in his voice startled me. Not because it was fragile, but because it was real. You can't fix the past, I replied. You can only stop repeating it. And you? He asked. Can you stop punishing us? I thought about all the years I had walked around carrying a wound he refused to see. About the debt I'd paid not just in money, but in sleepless nights and hospital visits and quiet humiliations. I'm not punishing you, I said. I'm protecting myself. His throat worked. From me. From the part of you that thinks love and support are separate, I said. From the part of you that believes pain is a lesson instead of a warning. He stared at me for a long time. I thought he might argue. Instead, he nodded once, almost imperceptibly. You got sharp, he murmured. I always was, I replied. You just taught me to keep it quiet. We didn't hug. We didn't reconcile. When he walked away, he looked over his shoulder once, like he wanted to say something else and couldn't. I watched him go and realized I no longer felt 9 years old in his presence. I felt like an adult standing across from another adult who had made choices he didn't fully understand the consequences of, and whose understanding was no longer my responsibility to manage. Later that night, as the bride and groom danced and relatives cried at the sweetness of it all, my brother slipped into the seat next to me. That was intense, he said under his breath. You saw. Everyone saw, he replied. They just pretend they didn't. We watched the dance floor in silence. He's different with me now, my brother admitted quietly. Less sure of himself. More careful. Good, I said. He should be careful with his children. My brother turned to look at me. Thank you, he said, for not letting them pretend what they did was normal. I blinked. You're thanking me for blowing up the script? He nodded. Someone had to. I was too comfortable to see it back then. A slow, reluctant warmth spread through my chest. For the first time, I realized that my refusal to play the role he'd been given might have saved my brother too, from becoming a man who believed he was entitled to the sacrifices of others just because he'd never been asked to make his own. As the night wore on, I said polite goodbyes and left early. Walking to my car in the cool air, heels in one hand, I realized my breathing felt easy. Seeing my father hadn't undone me. It hadn't dragged me backward. It had clarified the distance I'd already walked. And the best part was this. I hadn't expected closure and I didn't get it. What I got instead was confirmation. I hadn't imagined the imbalance. I hadn't exaggerated the pain. I had simply survived it and then chosen something else. After that wedding, life didn't suddenly fall into place with cinematic precision. It simply continued. But it continued on my terms. That was the difference. My days filled with client calls, project deadlines, design reviews, last-minute changes that used to send me spiraling but now just meant another problem to solve. When I opened my email, I saw my name not as a plea for unpaid labor but as a booked professional. People needed my work. People paid for it. That alone rewired something fundamental in my nervous system. I started therapy at Myra's insistence. You learn survival, she said, but you never learn safety. That's not the same thing. The first session, I sat on a soft chair opposite a woman with gentle eyes and a legal pad and felt ridiculous. I'm fine, I said immediately. I'm here because my friend thinks I'm not. The therapist smiled like she'd heard that 1,000 times. Tell me about figure it out, she said. The words hit me like a slap and a hug at the same time. We unpacked it slowly over weeks. How my father's sentence had become a cage. How being labeled strong had become a way to deny me help without guilt. How I had recorded every moment of neglect and turned it inward as proof that I simply wasn't worth the same effort. You had to become hyper-competent to stay afloat, she said one afternoon. That doesn't mean you never deserved a life raft. I stared at the ceiling. I got stronger, I muttered. Did you? She asked softly. Or did you just get better at pretending you weren't drowning? Question lodged itself in my chest. I carried it around for days. Slowly, painfully, I started to experiment with a new skill, asking for small things. Letting Mira pay for coffee sometimes. Saying I'm tired and actually resting instead of pushing through. Saying no without a 5-minute explanation. Felt wrong at first. Then it felt possible. My brother called more often too, not as a golden child calling from a castle but as a man in his 20s trying to assemble a self out of pieces that hadn't been curated for him since birth. I get why you're in therapy, he said once, half joking. I probably should be too. You should, I replied. Not because you're broken. Because you were built in a crooked house. One of the biggest shifts came quietly. I stopped needing to win imaginary arguments with my father in my head. For years, I'd catch myself replaying conversations, rewriting my lines, inserting perfect comebacks. Suddenly, I'd notice long stretches of time passing without that mental courtroom scene. The judge, jury, and executioner I'd hosted in my own skull had gone on an unannounced vacation. One day, my manager called me into her office with a look I couldn't read. How do you feel about leading a team? She asked. My heart stuttered. Like temporarily? Like permanently, she said. You've got good instincts. People trust you. We want to promote you. There it was, another milestone no one in my family had funded, yet one they would still someday point to as proof of the values they claimed to instill. I accepted. That night, sitting on my couch with takeout balanced on my knees, I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote a list, not of bills, not of due dates, but of things I wanted. A trip somewhere I'd never been. A course I didn't need for work but wanted for myself. A new camera to replace the one I'd sold that night in the grocery store parking lot. I didn't know when I'd be able to check each item off. But the fact that I was allowed to want them at all felt like rebellion. Months turned into another year. My savings grew. My apartment transformed slowly from a temporary shelter into a home. I bought plants and actually kept them alive. I framed my own artwork instead of taping up prints. I stood barefoot in my kitchen once, sunlight on the tile, coffee in hand, and realized with a jolt that this quiet, ordinary morning was the revenge my younger self would have never believed possible. Not a dramatic confrontation. Not a grand speech that made everyone gasp. Just a life no longer shaped around proving my worth to people who had already mispriced it. My father and I spoke occasionally now. Our conversations were mostly surface level. Weather, work, the dog. Sometimes he asked about my projects. Sometimes he made a comment that almost sounded like pride but backed away from it quickly, as if afraid of endorsing my independence too strongly. I didn't chase anything deeper. I had tried once early on to explain how it had felt to watch him write a $60,000 check for my brother while sending me to the bank alone. You're exaggerating, he'd said defensively. You're making me into a villain. The therapist's words came back to me then. You can't heal with someone who needs you to stay wounded to feel right about themselves. So I stopped trying to heal with him. I healed next to him instead. Parallel. Separate tracks. My brother, though, did his own work. He went to therapy. He apologized, not in one dramatic session but in pieces. A sorry for each time he'd weaponized my strength against me. A sorry for each time he'd told me to be grateful while enjoying luxuries he hadn't realized were denied to me. One evening, he said, I used to think you were just naturally better at handling stress. He shook his head. Now I see we're just carrying twice the weight. I didn't forgive him in that moment because there was nothing singular to forgive. Our entire childhood had been a system, not a single event. But I did reach across the table and squeeze his hand. We both survived the same house, I said. Just on different floors. He laughed, watery, and didn't let go. Somewhere along the way, the story in my head changed. I was no longer the forgotten child, the background character in someone else's family drama. I was the narrator. I was the one deciding which scenes mattered and which didn't. And funnily enough, in my version, the $60,000 check wasn't even the climax anymore. It was just the inciting incident, the moment that revealed the rules of the game and forced me to learn how to play my own. The first time I seriously thought about buying a home, the idea felt almost illegal. My entire 20s had been built on survival math, on splitting rent, stretching paychecks, memorizing the exact day each bill hit so none of them bounced. Owning something as big as a place with my name on the paperwork felt like a story that belonged to other people. People whose parents slipped them down payments as a head start. People who didn't begin their adult lives already buried under 5 figures of debt just for wanting an education. But the numbers on my screen didn't lie. Debt zero. Savings, more than I had ever seen in my account at one time. Income steady. Projection sustainable. My therapist smiled when I showed her the spreadsheet. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Unreal," I admitted. "Like I'm about to get in trouble for wanting too much." She tilted her head. "And what is too much, exactly?" I stared at the floor. "A place that's mine. A lock I control. Walls no one can threaten to take away from me." "That doesn't sound like too much," she said. "That sounds like safety." So I started looking. Not for anything huge or flashy. Just somewhere with decent light, a kitchen that didn't make me sad, and enough room to breathe. I walked through beige carpeted hallways with realtors who talked about investment and equity like magic words. Every time I stood in an empty living room, I pictured my 19-year-old self collapsed in a campus clinic bed, hooked up to a blood pressure monitor because she'd worked and starved herself into the ground. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her, "You make it out. You stand in rooms that belong to you." The place I chose wasn't staged to perfection. Smelled faintly of paint and dust. But sunlight spilled across the floor in the late afternoon in a way that made my chest ache. There was a small balcony. A view of trees instead of a parking lot. A door that closed with a solid, satisfying click. I signed the papers with hands that trembled, this time not from fear, but from the weight of doing something my family had never once imagined I'd accomplish without them. The day I moved in, Mira brought brownies and a plant I was 90% sure I'd kill. My brother came too, carrying boxes and looking around with wide eyes. "You really did it," he said. "You bought a place before I even figured out my major." I smiled. "I figured it out," I said, letting the phrase finally belong to me. We sat on the floor that night eating off paper plates, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and echoes. "Are you going to tell them?" my brother asked. He didn't have to specify who. "Eventually," I said. "Or they'll hear about it like they heard about graduation, through someone else. I don't know which is worse." He toyed with his cup. "He'll be angry," he said, "that you did this without his help." I looked around at the bare walls, the empty shelves. "He made sure I learned how to do things without his help," I replied. "He doesn't get to be surprised now." My brother hesitated. "He called me the other day," he said. "Asked if I thought you'd ever come back." The phrase sounded strange in my ears. "Come back where?" "To the way things were," he said. "To being his girl." I almost laughed. "His girl never really existed," I said. He knew a version of me that made his reflection look good. I don't fit in that frame anymore. The next week, my mother asked if she could visit. I agreed on the condition that it would just be her. No ambush reunions. No surprise appearances. She showed up with a bag of groceries and a bouquet of flowers that didn't match anything in the apartment and hugged me in the doorway longer than usual. She walked through the room slowly, fingertips trailing over the countertops, the backs of chairs. "You did all this," she said quietly. "By yourself." "I had help," I replied. "Friends. Therapists. Bosses who believed in me. I didn't add strangers on the internet who tipped extra when I looked tired." You know what I mean, she said. Your father, she trailed off. What about him? I asked. He doesn't know how to be wrong, she whispered. He only knows how to double down. I leaned against the counter. Not my problem to fix, I said. Not anymore. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs. He told me the other night that he was proud you turned out strong, she said. I waited. Then he said he doesn't understand why you hate him for it. The old word dug its nails into my spine. Hate. The label he preferred because it made him the victim of my ingratitude instead of the architect of my pain. I don't hate him, I said slowly. I just stopped letting him hurt me for free. She looked at me with wet eyes. I wish I'd protected you more. The rawness in her voice startled me. Why didn't you? I asked. Came out gentler than I expected. She twisted her hands together. Because I believed him, she said. I believed you were strong enough to handle anything. And I was so busy holding up his version of our life that I didn't see you falling apart in mine. There it was, a confession I'd wanted for years without knowing what it would sound like. I don't know how to fix it, she whispered. I thought of my therapist again. Of the way she always reminded me that some things aren't fixable. They're only survivable. You can't fix the past, I said softly. But you can stop pretending it didn't happen. We ate dinner at my small table, food she'd brought, plates I'd bought. 2 women sitting in a home that belonged to neither of their expectations. At the end of the night, she hugged me at the door and said, I'm proud of you. The words no longer felt like oxygen I was starved for. They felt like something extra. Nice. Not necessary. When she left, the apartment felt peaceful instead of empty. I stood in the center of the living room and turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. The walls. The windows. Quiet. No echoes of slammed doors. No footsteps pacing back and forth demanding obedience. Just space. Mine. For the first time, I let myself imagine future chapters that didn't revolve around healing from the previous ones. Maybe someday there'd be a partner. Maybe kids. Maybe more travel. Maybe none of that. But whatever came next would be built on a foundation I poured myself. Not on the shaky ground of someone else's approval. The night after my mother left, I sat on my balcony wrapped in a thin blanket, watching the city lights breathe in steady patterns. Cars moved like distant veins of light. Somewhere below, someone laughed. Somewhere else, someone argued. The world went on with or without permission. And for the first time in my life, I felt like it was going on with me instead of over me. I thought about the version of myself who had once stood in my childhood kitchen with a cup of coffee in her hands and a future that had just been handed back to her with a shrug. I thought about the man who had said, "You'll figure it out," and the girl who had taken those words like a sentence instead of a challenge. I had figured it out. But not in the way he meant. He had wanted me to become tougher so he wouldn't have to become softer. He had wanted me to absorb the weight so he wouldn't have to redistribute it. He had wanted me to disappear quietly into competence. What he never expected was that I'd build something he couldn't reach. My father and I never truly reconciled. There was no cinematic apology. No moment where he broke down and admitted everything. Instead, there were scattered conversations, neutral holidays, polite check-ins, a cautious truce built on the mutual understanding that the old rules no longer applied. He stopped asking me for help. I stopped needing his approval. My brother moved forward in his own uneven way. He changed majors. He failed once, then succeeded. He learned how it felt to want something without someone else paying for the wanting. We grew closer as adults than we ever had as children, bonded not by favoritism, but by shared disillusionment and slow-earned respect. One evening, sitting on my floor again like we had that night years ago, he said, "You know, Dad used to talk about your strength like it was proof he'd done the right thing." I looked at him. And now? He hesitated. Now I think your strength is proof you survived him. That might have been the closest thing to vindication I'd ever hear spoken out loud. My mother adjusted in her own quiet way. She stopped making excuses for him when she spoke to me. She stopped asking me to be patient. Instead, she started asking questions. About my work. About my plans. About how I was actually doing. Didn't erase the past. But it changed the present just enough to let it breathe. Sometimes very late at night, I still replay that moment in the kitchen. The check written for my brother. The nothing handed to me. The way my chest had hollowed out without a sound. For a long time, that memory had lived in me like a wound that kept opening. Now it felt more like a scar. Still there. Still a reminder. But no longer bleeding. I no longer measured my worth by the money my father spent on someone else. I no longer introduced myself to the world as the strong one like it was my only credential. I was a leader now. A homeowner. A woman with savings and boundaries and a future that didn't require permission. And I finally understood something that had taken me decades to learn. Strength that is forced on you is not a gift. It's a cost. And I had paid mine in full. The quietest kind of revenge isn't confrontation. It isn't screaming the truth in a room full of people. It isn't even walking away in dramatic fashion. The real revenge is this, living so well without their approval that their absence becomes irrelevant. My father once spent $60,000 to make sure my brother never had to feel what it was like to be alone in fear. And he spent nothing on me when I needed him most. In the end, that imbalance didn't destroy me. To find the line where I stopped belonging to their version of family and started building my own. I don't hate him. I don't even resent him the way I used to. I simply see him clearly now. And clarity is something no amount of money can buy. I figured it out. Not the way he meant, but the way that saved me.